If I asked you to name humanity's greatest invention, you'd probably guess fire, the wheel, sliced bread, maybe the internet. But you're completely ignoring the giant shared hallucination we all affectionately call money. Since we're all just blindly agreeing to let these magical pieces of paper and imaginary digital zeros dictate our entire lives, it begs the million-dollar question. So who exactly controls all the money? If you want the short answer, it's a tiny, super exclusive VIP club of central banks, giant megabanks, and governments. Spoiler alert, you're not on the guest list. Before currency existed, our ancient ancestors suffered through the utterly miserable barter system. If you wanted something, you had to find a trading partner with incredibly specific mutual desires. Imagine you're a tomato farmer who desperately needs new shoes. You have to wander around looking for a cobbler who intensely craves massive quantities of perishable vegetables. The whole setup functioned like prehistoric Tinder for produce and footwear. Eventually, humanity wised up and started using placeholder commodities like salt or animal skins. People hoarded these items simply because they knew others would accept them later. This concept evolved in fascinating ways across different cultures globally. Unfortunately, the barter system was highly unsustainable for any society attempting to build complex infrastructure. You absolutely cannot pay a large army with rapidly rotting vegetables. You also cannot fund the construction of massive stone temples using a giant pile of wet animal skin. Our ancestors needed a durable, easily recognizable medium of exchange to replace the chaotic nature of direct trading. They needed something that maintained its form over time. Hauling heavy chests of metal across oceans eventually became highly impractical for wealthy European merchants. Citizens desperately needed a secure location to store their physical wealth during periods of intense political instability, so they turned to local goldsmiths who owned iron vaults and employed heavily armed guards. You would hand your gold coins to the goldsmith for safekeeping, then the goldsmith would hand you a paper receipt indicating the exact weight on your deposit. Soon, merchants quickly realized that they could easily conduct daily business without physically moving the heavy metal. They simply handed the paper receipts to each other during transactions. The paper certificates officially became the accepted money. The goldsmiths closely observed this behavior and noticed something incredibly lucrative. Their customers rarely returned to withdraw their physical gold. The heavy metal just sat gathering dust in the vault for years. So, the goldsmiths realized they could print extra paper receipts and lend them out to desperate borrowers with high interest rates attached. They were printing legal claims for purely imaginary gold. Meanwhile, they gambled that their customers would politely avoid showing up on the exact same day to demand their physical property. This highly deceptive practice was the absolute birth of fractional reserve banking. It allowed a central entity to artificially expand the local money supply far beyond the physical constraints of precious metals. Governments eventually adopted this model to fund their own expanding operations and endless military campaigns, as they realized paper money provided a convenient mechanism to quietly siphon wealth from the general population without raising direct taxes. It was the ultimate medieval life hack. The paper money system required the public to blindly trust the institutions holding the gold. Whenever that trust fractured, the system experienced a catastrophic bank run. Hundreds of panicked citizens would flood the streets demanding their physical gold back from the goldsmith. The goldsmith would inevitably run out of metal and formally declare bankruptcy. The citizens holding the extra paper receipts were left with completely worthless pieces of parchment. The cycle of artificial expansion and subsequent collapse became a regular feature of the early European economy. The central authorities recognized the immense power of controlling the paper receipt supply. They began formalizing these private banking operations into official national institutions. And so, the Bank of England was established precisely to fund a massive war against France by issuing government notes, meaning the practice of creating currency out of thin air was officially legitimized. By the early 1800s, countries began formalizing this paper system into the highly structured global gold standard. So the United States officially tied the dollar to a specific weight of precious metal just to guarantee international trust. This meant a government could only print as much paper as it had physical gold sitting in a national reserve, which theoretically enforced extreme financial discipline on power-hungry politicians. But tying your economy to a shiny rock occasionally creates problems when you run out of shiny rocks during times of crisis. And then, during the depths of the Great Depression, the United States government found this physical restriction completely intolerable. So, President Franklin D. Roosevelt decided to drastically alter the financial landscape to increase government spending by signing Executive Order 6102 in 1933 to seize the wealth of the public. He basically forced American citizens to surrender transfer their privately held gold to the federal government under the severe threat of a $10,000 fine or 10 years in federal prison. Meanwhile, the government paid citizens a fixed paper rate for their gold and then promptly revalued the metal at a significantly higher price to artificially expand the national money supply. Talk about the ultimate magic trick. Following World War II, the Bretton Woods Agreement established the United States dollar as the primary global reserve currency, so foreign nations firmly pegged their money to the dollar for international stability, while the dollar remained directly tied to physical gold at exactly $35 an ounce. This system functioned adequately until the middle of the 20th century, when the United States government was simultaneously trying to fund a massive war in Vietnam alongside incredibly expensive domestic social programs, which meant the government had to print vast quantities of dollars to cover these structural deficits. Naturally, foreign nations grew highly suspicious of the sheer volume of printed paper and began demanding their physical gold back immediately. In fact, France actually sent a military battleship to New York to collect their national gold reserves, executing the most aggressive repo job in recorded history. Because the American reserves started draining at an alarming rate, President Richard Nixon went on television in 1971 and formally severed the convertibility of the dollar into gold. To truly grasp how a small, unelected group gained total control over this fiat system, we must rewind to the historical panic in 1907, when the American stock market collapsed dramatically after a massive failure involving copper stocks, and the banking system experienced a terrifying series of localized bank runs. So the legendary financier JP Morgan literally locked several prominent bankers inside his personal library to force a resolution, refusing to let them leave until they agreed to pool their capital to bail out the failing financial institutions. JP Morgan basically hosted the world's highest-stakes escape room for billionaires. After that, the banking elite realized they needed a better way to save the highly fragile financial system, so they desperately wanted a central mechanism to dictate the nation's credit and socialize their massive banking losses. But there was a catch. The American public historically despised central banking due to intense fears of monopolistic control. So in December of 1910, Senator Nelson Aldrich gathered several incredibly powerful financial titans to draft a secret solution, and then they boarded a private train car in New Jersey strictly under the cover of darkness. They even used assumed names and specifically told the train staff that they were going duck hunting, which is a genuinely real historical fact, by the way. They traveled to an exclusive luxury resort on Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia, and then for 9 consecutive days, these men sat in a room and drafted the foundational blueprint for the Federal Reserve System, keeping in mind they represented an estimated 1/4 of the entire world's massive wealth. Apparently, they designed a private banking cartel with a comforting public title, and meanwhile, the bankers utilized massive political deception by publicly complaining about the proposed legislation just to trick the citizens. Naturally, the general public falsely assumed the bill was highly beneficial since the wealthy Wall Street bankers hated it so much, making it reverse psychology at its absolute finest. Then Congress pushed the Federal Reserve Act through the legislature on December 23, 1913. While most politicians were already home eating holiday dinners with their families, and President Woodrow Wilson signed the bill into law to officially surrender the sovereign power of national money creation. Today, the Federal Reserve operates with extreme independence from the typical democratic voting process, which is why former chairman Alan Greenspan openly stated on television that no other agency of government can legally overrule their actions. Meanwhile, the actual mechanism of modern money creation relies entirely on a digital process based heavily on debt. Many citizens assume the government physically cranks a giant mechanical printing press to create massive stacks of green paper, but the actual reality involves a mathematically complex and far more insidious digital routine. So when the United States government decides to spend hundreds of billions of dollars on new infrastructure packages or military jets, the Treasury writes up a massive batch of bonds, which is just a formalized piece of paper promising the government will pay the holder back with high interest at a much later date. Then the government auctions these debt bonds to large commercial banking institutions, and then the Federal Reserve steps in and offers to buy those exact bonds from the commercial banks, paying for them by writing checks drawn on an account with a balance of exactly zero. Yes, the central bank literally summons the funds into existence simply by typing fresh digits onto a computer terminal, making it the ultimate Grand Theft Auto cheat code for unlimited funds. This newly created digital money is then deposited directly into the commercial banking system, a mechanism officially known as open market operations within the financial industry. So the Federal Reserve drastically expanded this specific tactic during recent economic downturns under the confusing title of quantitative easing, where they purchase massive quantities of risky mortgage-backed securities alongside standard government debt and then flood the banking sector with fresh liquidity to artificially suppress interest rates for corporate borrowers. Because of this, the balance sheet of the central bank continuously swells into the tens of trillions of dollars, meaning every single newly created dollar enters the modern system as a direct result of someone taking on massive debt. Hilariously enough, if every person and government simultaneously paid off all their financial obligations, the entire money supply would instantly vanish from existence. So the financial system acts exactly like a massive economic vampire feeding on borrowing, and it requires a constant unending supply of new debt to keep its black heart beating. This means the system physically cannot survive a prolonged period of intense financial responsibility. So if these citizens decide to pay down their credit cards and mortgages, the economy immediately contracts. To prevent this, these central planners actively discourage debt repayment by continuously keeping interest rates artificially low, because they desperately need the working class to take on larger auto loans and massive mortgages to continuously inflate the massive credit bubble. Ultimately, the creation of new debt is the absolute lifeblood of the entire global economic structure. Meanwhile, commercial banks get to participate directly in the wealth extraction process through the dark magic of fractional reserve banking. So, when you deposit $1,000 into your savings account, the bank simply takes that money and immediately lends almost all of it to other desperate customers while charging incredibly high interest rates. They might keep $100 in the vault while lending $900 to your friendly neighbor, and then your neighbor uses that newly borrowed money to buy a fast vehicle. Then the local car dealership deposits that exact $900 into their own commercial bank. So that second bank keeps $90 and quickly lends out the remaining $810 to another random borrower, which means your initial deposit magically transforms into roughly $10,000 of newly created credit circulating heavily through the local town. It's basically a state-sanctioned multi-level marketing scheme. And to make things even wilder, the Federal Reserve completely removed all reserve requirements for savings deposit accounts in March 2020, so commercial banks are legally permitted to lend out incredibly vast sums of money without holding any physical cash in reserve to back those loans. Because of this, roughly 97% of all money in the modern economy exists strictly as digital data sitting quietly on secure banking servers, and only a microscopic fraction exists as physical paper cash that you can actually hold in your hand. So every single dollar sitting in your pocket was loaned into existence by a highly profitable financial institution, meaning you're constantly operating inside a massive closed loop where the banks profit continuously from the endless recycling of your own personal deposits. Of course, the entire framework heavily relies on the assumption that citizens will politely avoid demanding their physical cash simultaneously, because if a mere 10% of bank customers decided to withdraw their funds on a random Tuesday, the entire banking sector would completely collapse by noon. Naturally, the banks heavily rely on government insurance programs to constantly pacify the public, and then they utilize these safety nets to justify taking increasingly dangerous risks with your deposited wages. They literally gamble your savings on complex financial derivatives while offering you a microscopic fraction of a percent in savings yield. While the highly educated academics aggressively defend this flawed system by claiming we critically need a central authority to manage economic panics, arguing that a centralized lender of last resort keeps the financial markets perfectly stable during intense global turmoil, but history paints a very different picture. Mainstream economists also defend the system by claiming a 2% annual inflation rate is highly beneficial for modern society, arguing that steadily rising prices deeply motivate consumers to spend their money today rather than waiting patiently for tomorrow. You know, trying to justify why eggs cost $1,000. So they claim this constant overspending keeps local businesses open and factory workers employed. And let's be honest, the highly celebrated 2% target is a completely arbitrary number invented by central planners to justify constant currency devaluation. If prices actually remain perfectly stable, citizens could easily plan for their long-term future, so they could save a fixed amount of money and confidently know it would purchase the exact same amount of groceries a decade later. Ultimately, we're actively participating in a rigged game designed entirely by the connected individuals who print the chips, because the modern banking system is fundamentally built entirely on infinite expansion and perpetual new debt creation. So your hard-earned money strictly serves as a temporary placeholder whose official value is constantly dictated by unelected central planners. And these central planners view the steady devaluation of your life savings as a completely necessary mechanism for forcefully maintaining global economic stability. So you must firmly embrace the stark reality that saving paper currency is a mathematically guaranteed path to severe poverty. The money supply will undoubtedly continue to expand until the absolute end of recorded time. And the federal government will undeniably always find a new unprecedented crisis desperately requiring a multi-trillion-dollar printing session. They will consistently need to fund new infrastructure projects and bail out over-leveraged commercial banks to prevent massive systemic contagion. And then every single time they write one of those magical zero balance balanced checks, they aggressively siphon a tiny vital piece of your labor. So the only viable strategy for long-term survival critically requires a total shift in your fundamental perspective on wealth, meaning you achieve true financial freedom by measuring your success outside the realm of depreciating fiat currency sitting quietly in a secure bank vault. You've got to escape the cash trap immediately, and you must continuously exchange your depreciating paper for hard assets that rapidly appreciate significantly faster than the central bank can physically print new digital digits. Wise people completely choose to invest in physical real estate, while prepared people continuously accumulate scarce commodities, because your primary objective is simply avoiding total financial loss. But you're not financially wise. You want to buy a $15 latte and eat takeout every night. You're constantly playing a massive defensive game against a sophisticated mathematical machine completely designed to slowly drain your economic energy. But once you realize the entire global currency market is a deeply synchronized illusion, one that's built to bust your wallet's balls, you can finally start making strictly rational choices.